Hi, this is Ryan Thomas with Ryan Thomas Productions, and today we're going to be doing a walkthrough of the Hollywood Choir's official product demo, Dragons and Fairies. Since this is the first video on my channel like this, I figure I'll take some time to introduce myself. Again, I'm Ryan, and I write soundtracks mostly for film and TV shows, pretty much full-time. And on the side, I offer educational resources that range from giving private lessons over Zoom to helping people build templates and that sort of thing. Now, I want to outline what we will and will not be talking about today. Due to time constraints, I can't take you through the routing, the mixing process, or the patches and mic positions that I'm using. So I'm just going to be covering the MIDI programming techniques and orchestration. However, if you would like to buy this template, you will know all there is to know about how this piece was made, and then you can use the template for any of your own future projects. So yes, this is kind of an advertisement for my East-West template, but it's also just an educational resource for those of you who, like me when I was just starting off, really just want to get a look inside the session of a product demo to see what all goes into pieces like these. Now, I want to be clear that this isn't my actual scoring template that I use for other film and TV shows. This is just to show you what can be done with only East-West Composer Cloud instruments and stock Logic plugins. And I also wanted to maximize compatibility for those who want to buy the template. And of course, since this was originally a product demo, I would obviously be cheating if I made something that used other companies' instruments. Now that said, I would absolutely have no problems scoring a film with this template. It's perfectly capable, and I've worked with East-West instruments almost exclusively for a large part of my career. And I'll say that even in my workhorse template, which has like over 400 tracks, I would say that about a quarter of those are still East-West, which is saying a lot when you've got instruments from literally, dozens of other companies. So again, this template is perfectly capable of handling any project that needs an orchestral-based score. And I'm hiding a lot of instruments here that I'm not using in this demo. I'll go ahead and actually just show you what all is included in this template. You've got full strings, full brass, full woodwinds, percussion, choirs, and even some ethnic instruments that I use the most often, including hammered dulcimer and some of the instruments from Silk. So it's a pretty versatile template, I would say. And again, if you really want to know what goes into demos like these, then I would encourage you to just go ahead and buy the template, and then you can just have it and use it for your other projects. Okay, so all that said, let's go ahead and just get started. The way I like to do these, if you've seen my other tutorials on East-West's YouTube page, is to take it one phrase at a time and then break it down by instrument section. So let's go ahead and check out our first phrase. As you can see, I can't get all the MIDI data here in one window, so I'll be doing a good bit of scrolling. So let's go ahead and, since we're going to focus on strings first, we're just going to zoom in on this information. Let's go ahead and stop there and break it down. So we're going to start with strings. And as you can see, I'm just using legato patches here. Violin 1, violin 2, viola, and cello. So just a little 4-part deal here. And let's solo our strings buses here. All right. So not a lot to talk about there. For these patches that I'm using, CC11 controls the dynamics, and CC1 controls the vibrato. And usually they're just mirroring each other because I actually have CC1 and CC11 mapped to the same controller on my keyboard. As generally speaking, as a string player is playing more expressively and louder, their vibrato intensity also tends to increase. But for this, I wanted the vibrato to kind of outpace the dynamics, so I went ahead and just jacked the vibrato up a little bit. Okay, let's add the woodwinds. I'm sorry, let's add the brass here. So there isn't much to talk about here. We just have this solo French horn coming in halfway through the phrase. What a beautiful French horn sample, man. The East-West brass solo French horn, I've just never heard any other solo French horn that really even comes close to that. Okay, let's add the woodwinds. And you're going to see a lot of doubling in the woodwinds here. I believe the English horn, well, no, the English horn is kind of doing its own thing. The bassoon is going to be doubling the cello. So let's see what they all sound like together. Okay, so English horn is actually doubling violin 2. Okay, let's go ahead and add the choirs. And I'm just using the women's word builder patch here. And I just have these kind of nonsense lyrics, na, re, mu, so. And that's just kind of my default phrase that I like to use, really for no other reason other than that it sounds cool. So let's give it a listen. All right, and finally, let's add our percussion. And at the beginning, you know what, I'm not going to take you through this again because we just have this little mark tree at the very beginning. And it does fill up some space there. But otherwise, not much to talk about in terms of percussion. So let's move on because this is a 3-minute long demo. And we'll start from about right here. And we're into the next phrase. And that's a bit of a longer phrase, but most of the colors are pretty consistent throughout. So let's go ahead and check out our strings. Okay, so I've got these flautando strings from Symphonic Orchestra. Really nice patch. They're just nice and airy. So we've got the violins on these two notes here, just in octaves. And then viola and the cello are kind of playing this melody line in octaves. And then you have the basses joining them in bar 8. So let's give that a listen. Once again, fairly explanatory. I did miss these 2 pizzicato bass notes here in the MIDI data, but again, not much to talk about. Okay, now let's add the brass. And looks like we've got tuba and French horn in this phrase. So let's start back here. Okay, now I do want to talk about a technique that I'm using in the French horns. I wanted a nice mellow brass sound, but I wasn't getting quite the amount of volume that I needed from the French horns. And so for this particular patch, CC11 just controls volume. It doesn't control timbre, whereas CC1 will control both the volume and the timbre. You can think of CC1 in this patch as how hard the player is actually blowing into the instrument. So again, this is a good way to get a nice mellow sound from your brass if you need it to be poking out in the mix a little bit more than it is. And the tuba here is just doubling the string basses, so not much to talk about there. Now let's add the woodwinds. And bassoon is going to be doubling the cello here. Oboe is doubling violin 2, and then it cuts out. Okay, let's add the choirs. I am also using the men's word builder patch with the same phrase programmed in here. And it might sound a little bit strange at times because the men's and the women's choir might not be singing the same word. And that's fine. Obviously, when the choir bus is soloed, you'll notice it. But in the context of the mix, you really can't tell. So let's go ahead and give it a listen. Okay. And I will say that when it comes to programming, cinematic choir phrases that don't necessarily need to be saying anything sensible, just make life easy on yourself. Have something simple that sounds cool. Okay, now let's add our harp. And let's go ahead and throw in our percussion as well. Okay, and this is the Timpani key switch patch that I'm using. So here I've triggered one of the programmable Timpani rolls, and you can see where I am basically creating that crescendo with the control code 11 and 1 here. In this patch, this controls volume, and this controls how hard the player is actually hitting the timpani. And I should note that I also have this little Dynastio Daiko, which is being filtered in the actual play engine. And this basically acts as a sub boom, and you can hear that here. Really nice way to achieve that effect. Okay, and now we're kind of into the meat of the piece here, so let's go ahead and unsolo everything and give it a listen. All right, let's stop there and break it down starting with strings. Now, we actually don't have much going on in the strings here. We have the basses and the cello just playing these notes basically every other bar here. The tempo is fairly fast. And then we have the cello and the violins coming in with this melody line here in measure 20. So let's solo the strings and give it a listen. Now, one thing I want to point out is that I'm using the mod speed patch here, and in both the cello as well as the basses, I have triggered the marcato articulation, which is the longest of the short articulations in this patch. Okay, let's move on to brass. And in this section, we've got French horn, trombone, as well as tuba. And these are just going to be doubling the choir that we will hear in just a minute. There we go. So you can hear that in bar 16, we added another French horn section here just to fatten those chords up a little bit. Otherwise, I think we're just using all legato patches here. So let's add the choir. I'm sorry, let's go ahead and add woodwinds first. There's actually, you know what, there's not much to go over here. It looks like the bass clarinet and the contrabassoon are just going to be doubling the basses and the cello on those low marcato notes. So let's also add the choirs. And in this case, we've got the men's choir in a lower register. Okay. Again, I just love those word builder patches. They're once you program the right phrase in there, they're just so usable. Okay, let's add the percussion. And here we've got the gong from symphonic orchestra, just kind of filling up some space here. And you also have the lowest of the epic toms hitting at a very light velocity, which gives you this very broad, this deep frequency response from the percussion here. So let's give that a listen. Here's another gong hit. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next phrase. And we'll start right back here for context. We have this crescendo into the next part. Okay, let's stop there, and we're going to break it down, again, starting with strings. Okay, so we start off this phrase with our entire string section now on these shorts, and they just sound like this. And then we're bringing this melody back in. Okay, and one thing I do want to point out is that for this little moment in bar 34, I'm taking the basses and the cello from these legato patches here to this marcato articulation that gives you that nice bum, bum, bum. And it's just little touches like that that can really add a lot of realism to your orchestrations. Okay, let's add brass. And we've got these really awesome, gnarly low brass hits from Hollywood Brass that are doubling the low strings. And then we bring in the rest of the brass section except for the trumpets. So let's give that a listen. Now we're bringing in the French horns. Sorry, I forgot about our trumpets right here. Let's actually go ahead and take a closer look at those because there is some key switch programming going on here. So we're starting off on a just a sustain, and then transitioning to for these two notes here, they're the shortest notes in the key switch patch, which I think is called. Let's actually see what they call them. The staccato SS double tongue. And then, so we're starting off again with this legato note here in this patch, and then going to this patch. And again, we've got these two notes here are going to be that shortest note, and then this note here is going to be slightly longer, but it's still a short articulation. And then we are landing on just a regular sustain here. And again, we've got a lot of doubling going on. The French horn is doubling the violins. The tuba is doubling the basses and the cello. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. And again, we've got more doubling here. So we've got the flutes and the clarinet, as well as the oboe, that are going to be doubling the women's choir that we will hear in just a minute. And let's go ahead and give it a listen. Okay, and here you can see that the Legato Bassoon is also doubling the basses and the cello, as well as that low brass. And I've done something similar in the bassoon that I did with the tuba. These notes here are legato, and then this is going to trigger the marcato articulation in the key switch patch, and you can see those notes here in this track. And I'll just go ahead and actually solo that. Well, yeah. So let's solo this. And you'll see me use this technique quite a bit. So now we've got our choir as well as the percussion. And I think that's actually everything, so I don't need to solo anything. Okay, now for this roll going into bar 38 here, again, I'm using the key switch patch in the timpani, and it starts off with just a regular hit on these 2 8th notes here. I'll go ahead and solo that. And I really like using this technique because you can kind of hide the beginning of this roll in the tail of one of the hits, and you can hear that. And it sounds fairly natural. Okay, so let's move on to this next phrase. And this is where the fun really starts. So let's start back here for context. Okay, let's stop there and break everything down. There's obviously quite a bit to go over here. So we are starting off with string shorts. And then in bar 43, we are taking pretty much everything to legato patches, as well as some runs. Okay, let's give it a listen. Sorry, I'm going to need to expand this just a little bit so that we can get all the MIDI data in here. There we go. And let's also just, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. All right. Now, as you can hear, this doesn't sound like great on its own, but this is why layering is really important with pretty much all MIDI programming. It doesn't matter what library you're using. Layering is really important. And could I have programmed this better? Yeah, probably. But it sounded fine in context, when you add the other instruments. With things like runs especially, I like to tell people all you really need is kind of the suggestion of the run. It doesn't need to be perfect on its own if you were to solo it. It just kind of needs to be felt. And as long as you get the idea across, that's really all that you need to do, especially if you are going to layer, say, the string runs with woodwind runs. That definitely adds more realism to it. And there are other things that you can do, like adding Glock at the beginning or the end of a run, or adding like a Mark Treagless. So let's listen to it again and look for when we transition from the shorts to the runs and legato patches. Another thing I want to point out, and this is some fairly secret sauce stuff, is that the legato offset for the basses isn't usually quite as extreme as it needs to be for like the violins. So in this tempo, We're at 128. I actually need to offset the violins by a good 16th note, whereas with the basses, it's more like not quite a 32nd note. And I found that to hold true in pretty much every tempo. It's just how they are. And one other thing I want to point out is that there's a lot of articulation programming going on here with CC1. In this particular patch, the short mod patch, CC1 controls what kind of articulation is being triggered. So at 81, this is actually triggering the staccato on bow, which is why you do get a little bit of a slur here, even though this is a short patch. And in context, it really just sounds like, a string section playing a connected line very quickly. Okay, let's move on to the brass. And there is also a lot of content here. Sorry, I just need to get a handle on where we're starting here. All right. All right, now that is quite a bit to figure out with all that MIDI data selected. So let's actually just take this one instrument at a time. So this is what our trumpets are doing. Okay. And I'm using the solo trumpet here basically as a second trumpet. When I added a full section of 3 more trumpets, it just sounded a little bit too full. And I even tried the 2 trumpet patch, but it still sounded too full. So, sometimes you just got to trust your ear. So let's check out what the French horns are doing. And, you can see where I'm going from the legato patches here to the key switch patch. And I'm just key switching here between a sustain and the staccato articulations. All right, now let's look at our trombones and tuba. And these 2 notes here are going to be key switch triggers, so you won't actually hear those. All right, now let's move on to our woodwinds. And we've just got some little runs here. Nothing too crazy. And once again, let's go ahead and break this down by almost instrument by instrument. We'll have the Piccolo Flute and the other flutes here. Now, these are just the playable runs patches, except for, well, it looks like we've actually got a couple things going on here. We've got the regular legato patches and the runs that are sort of going into those. This little run going into bar 29, I'm using the flute runs patch, but then for these 2 lines here, I'm using the regular legato flute patch. Now for piccolo, I'm just using the runs patch. So let's listen to this again. right, now let's look at our clarinets. Okay, and that pretty much does it for the woodwinds there. And you can see the way that I've got these runs programmed. You know, for the CC1 data here, I'm just doing a little bit of a drop. You generally want to have an accent at the beginning of a run because I'm actually a woodwind player, and you kind of tongue that note the hardest, and you hit it the hardest. So, you know, that's just kind of a general principle. I guess here, I didn't actually need to do that just because the note was recorded with a little bit of an accent to it already. Okay, now let's add our choirs. All right, now let's add the harp as well as our percussion. So there's not much harp content here. You've just got this gliss going into bar 39. So we're not going to cover that too much. But let's check out what's happening in the percussion because there is a good bit to talk about here. Okay, so we are starting right here. We're going to start right back here for context. All right, and just so you can see it a little bit more broken down here, this is what our snare is doing. This is what the timpani is doing here. And here we've got the bass drum that is joining the timpani on these hits here. And of course, you've got a cymbal swell going into this section. And you've got the Dynastio Daiko, which is, again, I like to use it just kind of as a sub-boom effect. So that does it for that phrase. Let's go ahead and move on to this next section here. And we'll take it from right here for context. Let's stop there, and we're actually only going to break this down from bar 46 to, we're going to say 50. And let's start with strings. And this is pretty simple stuff here. Okay, and you can see that I've got violin 1 and 2 in octaves here, and then they actually collapse into one single octave, and that's just an orchestration decision that I made to just switch up the colors a little bit. And the viola here is actually a tremolo articulation from the viola key switch patch. Okay, now we don't really have any brass content here. Just maybe a little bit of overhang from the previous phrase. So we're not going to bother with brass. Now we do have this really nice alto flute solo here. The Legato Alto Flute from Hollywood Orchestral Woodwinds is just absolutely beautiful. And it also does really well in a mix. It just kind of tends to poke out in a nice way. Okay. Now we just have choir and I think some harp, yeah, as well as some tuned percussion. So this is just kind of a nice little magical sounding reprieve, because most of this piece is pretty heavy. Okay, and just to break it down so you can see who's doing what, this is what our celeste is doing, and this is what our harp is doing. So they're outlining the same chord, but they're doing so in different ways. So let's go ahead and move on from here. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the strings again. And you have this nice big full string section here, kind of Lord of the Rings-esque a little bit. I'm sorry, I need to just solo the strings here. All right. And we're not doing any crazy, key switching or articulation shifting. Aside from just right here, we've got the violins hitting this sort of accented tremolo here. And I just went ahead and programmed in the accent here with the CC11 data. All right. Let's throw in the brass. Here's the French horn doubling the cello. And this is another situation where I just opted to use solo trumpets. There is a trick, by the way, to having a solo trumpet 1 and a solo trumpet 2, which I just don't have the time to get into. Again, if you want to buy the template, it just requires combining a couple patches, because if you try to use the same solo trumpet patch, you just duplicate it, you can actually run into some phase issues if they happen to end up on the same note. All right, let's go ahead and, we don't have any woodwind content here, so let's add, I'm sorry, we do have some woodwind content. We've got the bassoon that's doubling the cello in that little melody line at bar 50. And you can just hear all the color that bassoon is adding there. And here, the English horn is doubling the French horns, as well as the cello. All right, and then we've got our choir. Again, fairly self-explanatory. We're just using the same phrase. All right, and looks like we don't really have much in the way of percussion. So we do have the harp introducing this section on just this little roll here. And really, it's mostly serving to, number one, yes, to kind of give you the chord, but also to provide some emphasis to that violin tremolo entrance. So let's unsolo everything and take it from here so that we can have some context for the next section. All right, let's stop it there and break it down, starting with our string shorts. All right, nothing too complicated here. Again, we're in the short mod patch, and it looks like I've got the shortest articulations triggered for all of these, including the basses. Okay, let's add our brass. And we've got the French horns doing this cool little thing here. You'll hear it. And it looks like we just have the French horns for this section. And they're pretty much just going to be actually on the same articulation, which is this is the shortest note in the key switch patch. It's like the staccato double tongue, I believe. I found that you can kind of simulate a rip, even though you can actually cue up some pre-recorded rips from, I believe, Symphonic Orchestra as well as maybe Hollywood Brass. Don't quote me on that. But you can kind of simulate it actually with just those short notes here. And I'll go ahead and just solo that so you can hear what it sounds like on its own. Yeah, really fun patch. It's really amazing some of the stuff you can do with a lot of these key switch patches from East West. They're just so versatile. Really love them. Okay, let's go ahead and solo everything again. We're going to add our woodwinds here. And we've got a little flute run introducing this section. And the flute's just on this little staccato passage here. And we also have a little descending flute run that is introducing the next section. And you know what? I moved all these regions by one measure, so these time signatures are going to be slightly off, but it's fine. It doesn't affect the sound at all. So let's go ahead and add our choirs. And again, this is just the word builder patch that is kind of simulating staccato articulation in the choir. You know, it's a fairly nimble patch for what it is, and it works just fine in this context. Now let's add our percussion. We've got some glockenspiel, some triangles, and some timpani, as well as the tambourine from Goliath. I'm actually going to deselect this data because it's just, you know, you can see exactly what it's doing, and you can also hear it. So let's just focus in on the triangles, the timpani, and the glock. And let's also just solo the percussion section so you can hear exactly what it's doing. Okay, and we have that timpani roll going into this next phrase, and that is triggered with the E0. All right, so let's check out this next part here. All right. Now this is going to bug me, so I need to fix it. So this needs to go back here. And this, there we go. Okay, because I like to talk about measures. It's a very convenient way to explain what's going on. So let's focus in on our strings. We've got some fun stuff going on here. You've got the violins playing this melody in octaves, and you've got this counter melody staccato line in the cello, and the basses are just holding down these bass notes here, and they are bass shorts. Okay, so a few things going on here. Once again, we've got this counter melody in the cello, but we also have a counter melody going on in the violas, the legato violas. So quite a bit happening here, but then everything, we drop the basses entirely to kind of lighten things up, and we have the cello on this melody here. And you actually have some crossover in register between the cello and the violas, which, you know, sometimes you got to break the rules. That's just how it goes. So everything is still just in the legato patches here. And then to crescendo into this next part, what I've done is halfway through bar 68, I've taken the cello off of this legato articulation and put them in this short patch with the marcato articulation triggered. And then they're joined by the basses in measure 69 to help it build a little bit. Okay, let's add the brass. So we've cut out the brass again to just lighten this section. And then here what happens is the tubas join the double basses and the cello on this descending line here, along with the trombones. And the French horns are just holding out this note in octaves, just doing this crescendo into bar 70. So up until measure 65, you've just got French horn and trombone legato, and they're actually outlining the chord. And a really fun, thing to do to switch up, to very subtly switch up the texture and the color of a passage is to go from an open chord voicing to a closed chord voicing. And that's exactly what's happening between measures 62 and 63. So just keep that in mind when you're writing. Okay, and now we've got the clarinets and the oboes as well as the bassoon outlining the chord with these staccato notes here. Now you've also got the bassoon that's actually doubling the cello on that counter melody. You'll see me doubling bassoon with cello quite a bit. So let's actually just look at this data first before we add everything else. And you've got the legato clarinet just kind of doing this little, it's really just doing its own thing, and it is helping to outline the chords along with the other staccato notes here. So now let's go ahead and add our runs. It looks like we just have flutes and the piccolo here. And a really effective way to make your flute runs pop out is to add the piccolo up the octave. And especially in a thicker part of the orchestration like this, it can be really, really helpful. Okay, let's add the choirs. And, we're in the word builder patch. They're just outlining the chord here. Once again, you can see where I went from a closed chord voicing here to an open one. It can be really nice to do with a choir. And we also have this ah patch that is, this is actually a legato ah patch, so it's carrying this melody here. All right, let's add the harp as well as our percussion. And we don't have much going on in the harp aside from just some glisses that are introducing the various phrases here. Okay. This is Timpani. Harp, and then we're adding some Celeste to add some sparkle on that top end. Oh, and it looks like that's got moved by a 16th note, so I'll be sure to fix that before I upload the template. And one thing I want to point out is another great way to make your woodwind runs pop is to use what I'm going to call a Mark Tree gliss. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's in symphonic orchestra. And it's just this little sound. And you can just hear how much this section actually loses when I remove this. So this is with, oh, sorry, we triggered the, one of the trills. Yeah, we triggered the clarinet trill here, so we actually need to start back here. There we go. Now here's without that little Mark Tree gliss. It just really adds so much, and it's a really, really easy way to, again, just make your runs pop. Okay, and now we are into this last phrase. Or I should say this last section. I am going to go ahead and break this up into actually two parts. So we're going to have this phrase here, and then I think we're going to stop before we get to this big climactic ending. So let's start here for context. let's go ahead and break this down. So we've got the cello as well as the basses just playing this one note, and we are in the short patches here. And we've got the violins and the violas just kind of accenting things every other bar here. And you can see where I've triggered the staccatissimo articulation, which is the shortest note in the mod short patch. All right, now we've got brass doing a lot of the heavy lifting here along with the choir. So we're going to start right here again. All right. And you know, one of the keys to orchestrating is always giving yourself a place to go. So I'm not just going to start off with full brass here. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty much just starting off with French horn 1 and 2, along with some accents in these low brass hits. And then in the second part of the phrase, I am then adding the trombones and the trumpets. Okay, let's add our woodwinds. We don't have much going on here. As a matter of fact, we just have these little pre-recorded flute glisses. All right. Not too much to talk about there. With these, for this tempo, if you offset it by about a 16th note, then the very highest note of that little gliss will hit on the beat. Okay, now let's add our choirs. And the brass is pretty much just doubling the choir. Obviously, the choir is giving you a much thicker chord here. Quite honestly, I wouldn't call this the best part writing, but it worked for this, particular part of this particular piece. So, at the end of the day, just trust your ears. All right. And finally, we have just got the percussion here. And there is a good bit going on here. You've got the epic toms as well as the Middle Earth ensemble kind of giving you this nice driving beat. And you've got the crash that is hitting every other bar with the violin shorts and those little flute glisses. And then you've got snare and timpani as well. Sorry, we need to start back here. The wrong articulation was triggered in the timpani. And one thing I want to point out is that I am doing a short snare roll before each hit. Oh, sorry. There we go. All right. Now we are into this the climax here. So let's go ahead and give that a listen, starting from, well, let's just start from the previous phrase. All right, there's a lot going on there, but not to fear. We are going to break it all down, as we always do. Okay, so we've got this ascending melody here that is starting off in the cello and is then taken over in violin 1 and 2. And the viola is just going to be sitting on this, I believe this is a tremolo. Yep. Okay, so let's listen to it. And obviously these last two notes here are just going to be in the short patches. And you know, there's really actually not a whole lot to talk about there. And you can see the CC11 here is getting pretty hot. We're pretty much at the very top of the range here by the time we get to the end. And I just love how expressive Hollywood strings are. All the Hollywood series instruments just, you know, they go from just so soft to so loud. You've just got such a huge range of dynamics there. And actually, you know, there's a lot of libraries that just don't give you quite that range. That's one of the things I love about East West. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the brass here. So we start off the first half of this climax without really any bass elements. And again, we are giving ourselves kind of room to build. So we are adding the trombones as well as the tuba in measure 80. But before that, we just have the French horns and the trumpets. And you can see I'm using the key switch patches for those short notes with a little bit of a run up in the French horns. Just like I was doing earlier to kind of simulate those rips, I'm doing the same thing here. Okay, now let's add the woodwinds. And we've got some trills. We've got the bassoon here that's doubling the cello. So actually, the clarinet and the oboe are kind of doing their own thing. They're not doubling anybody. You could maybe say that they're doubling the violas because they are in the same note, but the clarinet and the oboe are doing trills here. And then the flutes join violin 1 and 2 as they take over this ascending line. And we end with that little flute gliss for that hit at 82. So let's listen to everything together. And let's actually solo the woodwinds so that you can hear what they are doing just by themselves. All right. Now let's add the choirs. We're going to solo everything again. And the choir is really not doing much. Again, we're just, we're not even using that many patches for choir. Hollywood choir is very easy to work with. So let's see, I believe we're starting here. yeah, really not much to say there. It's just such an easy patch to work with. You really don't need, as long as you've got the, the right phrase programmed in along with the right expression data here, it's going to sound great. It's just a great library. Okay, now let's add our percussion. This is where things get a little bit more interesting. Let's actually select some of that MIDI data so that you can see what's going on here. That would be helpful. So there's really not a whole lot going on in the percussion section, but what is going on is just really super helpful. So you've got the timpani here that is introducing the low brass that comes in at measure 80. And that ascending melody line in the strings and in the woodwinds is also being doubled in the Glock to help it pop out a little bit. If you've ever got a melody line that is struggling to be heard in the context of a mix, try adding Glockenspiel and see what happens. Okay, and one other thing I wanted to cover was I'm doing a very similar thing in the timpani that I did a few phrases ago. However, this one is a little bit more complicated. You've got a flam going into a hit that goes into a roll here. And I'll just let you hear what that sounds like on its own. One more time. So we're using the key switch to trigger just the regular hit, and then we are transitioning right here to that roll, and we're just kind of using the the tail of this sample here to cover up the entrance of that roll. Okay. So that, I think, is going to do it for the piece. I want to thank you so much for watching the video, and congratulations if you made it this far. If you are interested in learning more about the mixing process and the way that things are being routed and all the patches that I'm using for the piece, then I would encourage you to just go ahead and buy the template. This took almost 2 days to build, and even if this saves you, an hour or two of time on a project, that could very well be worth it. Also, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If I'm being completely honest, I don't really know if I'm going to be uploading videos like these on a regular basis just because they take such a huge amount of time to produce, and my day job is still writing soundtracks for film and TV. So if I get enough positive feedback from this video, I may very well make this a regular thing. But in any case, thanks again for watching, and keep making that beautiful music.